Austin, I'm kind of curious about what you wanted to talk about today.
Well, I was neither in one of these homes,
Hmm.
um, nor related to anybody, but I was in the Independent Baptist Church for a long time, and so I did see the girls come through, and it was always just a mystery to me. And so we had access because I went to a fundamentalist college. I went to
Okay.
Pensacola. We had access to a lot of archives for the Sword of the Lord, and through that, um, which was a major fundamentalist newspaper. And so it was always a curiosity to me. Also, I wasn't raised, going to the Christian school or anything. I chose fundamentalism for myself. Um, my home life was a little unruly, so it was a place with rules and everything. And I have to say, the ones that I knew were just exactly what they said they were. I didn't see a lot of hypocrisy or anything like that, but life led me to Pensacola, and then I took a church in Florida, and so that was kind of the last stand for the Camerons, was that town that I
Yes.
lived in. And so of course, that home that they started, kind of phased out as they did, but I was very familiar with the home that took it over and would see those girls out and all that. And so I began to study and on all this, and it always bothered me. There were parts of the Independent Baptist Church I loved. I loved the fervor. I loved the rules. I loved that you always knew who was, the brethren, that you could call on them. I love that. You don't find community like that everywhere, and people search for community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Of course.
and so, a lot of people don't have that today. But kind of as an outsider, quote unquote, not being raised in it, there were things that were normal to other people that just could never be normal to me. And one of those things was the girls' homes. And so I began listening to, early testimonies and reading things and all that. And I'm no expert or anything, but I'm real good with the names and all that. And of course, my years as a pastor, um, I'm just good at that. And so the girls or the ladies, they're grown now, they went through all this trauma, and there's so many broken pieces because when you're going through a traumatic experience, I think uh, you're focused on yourself and trying to survive.
Yeah. Exactly.
And there's a
Exactly.
lot of broken pieces, and they'll remember some people and they won't remember other people, and they'll be there at the same time, and a lot of that survival. So I just thought, just a feeble attempt that I could maybe fill in some of the cracks and names and years and all that over the years that I have studied. um, because Lester Roloff was a figurehead, uh, and he wasn't guiltless, because as another famous fundamentalist pastor would always say, everything rises and falls on leadership. If
Yeah.
if he didn't know, he should have known. I believe he didn't know a lot, but he should have known. He should have looked behind. But he was just a figurehead. He didn't work in those homes every day.
No, it was the Camerons that worked in those
It was
homes.
him, and it was a lot of other people besides them.
Right.
And
The
so
Crummies, and I went to the school that was behind the Rebecca home
right,
at the
and
Roloff farm. Yeah.
then that school that you went to was a had been moved because Brother Roloff didn't actually start a church. He was a pastor of a church called Park Avenue Baptist Church.
Right. It was in Corpus Christi. Yep.
Right. And he started he took the church and was the pastor there, and then started a day school, a Christian school. And then he moved all that out there. So everything out there, and it's no wonder nobody has real good, clear memories of things. Everything was brand new out there, when y'all were out there, basically.
Well, when I went to the elementary school that he had two of them. He had one in Corpus in town. It was called the Park Avenue Elementary School is what it was called.
Mm-hmm.
And when I finished that school, I went to the farm, and that school was called the Rebekah Christian School.
And it was behind in that
It was
big
behind,
white building.
correct, right next to the Come and Dine, that little
Yeah.
dining area. Yes.
And all that, basically, when those girls got there, I mean, it was all brand new. The church was new. The church building was new. And, of course, he renamed the church, and it was reincorporated and all that. But, of course, the first ones were the ones from the Park Avenue Church that was in Corpus. And he renamed it. And I'll tell you what's always been eerie to me is the similarities between him and Jim Jones.
I never noticed the similarities.
Well, they were both strong leaders.
Yes.
They both started out really wanting to help people. Jim Jones, he was a media darling. They loved him. Brother Roloff's church was People's Baptist Church.
Right.
Jim Jones's church was the People's Temple. It was right about at the same time. And, people look for a leader and they look for a father figure. And in the midst of chaos, they'll look for somebody like that. And the late 60s and the early 70s was a very chaotic time. And so they looked for leaders, and Brother Roloff was one of those leaders.
Yeah.
He said, not the way things are supposed to be. And people like to be told what to do to an extent. They like to be told what to do, and particularly in a preacher. They want somebody that'll say, no, you need to stop doing that, or you need to start doing this or something. It's a help to a lot of people. But the problem with all that down there was that's not a church. He didn't have a church. He didn't have congregants. He had people that weren't allowed to leave. But anyway, and that's different.
Yeah.
That's different church. And that's why it all morphed into what it did. And I think that's why the state took so long to do anything about it. They really didn't know what to do, because in one way it seemed like a church, but then in a lot of ways it wasn't.
Well, some of the girls that I've had on this podcast, I've told them, I believe that Roloff had good intentions. I believe he really wanted to help these troubled kids. Okay. But I think what happened, and Donna, who was there, she said it perfectly. She said, I think what happened was it got too big for him.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Because not only did he have the Rebekah home, he had the City of Refuge, the Anchor home, the Lighthouse home, the Jubilee home, and then he had an old folks home in Mississippi or Missouri somewhere. Then he had the Bethesda home, and then he had a place for Native Americans called the Regeneration Reservation in Arizona.
That's right.
So he had all these homes, and he was out evangelizing. He was on this little plane, flying all over the place to universities, especially was not Jack Isles, but some of these other universities.
Well, Jack Hiles did start a college, and of course that had tons of abuse come out of it at the same time.
Yeah.
When things go unchecked, and another thing is that all this morphed into Baptist polity, or the way traditionally that Baptists are supposed to work, is that you voluntarily put yourself under the watch care of somebody else. So Southern Baptist Church starts, and of course they can have problems, but they're required to join the Baptist Association. And so if there be any trouble, the Baptist Association can step in and say, now, you said that you'd follow our rules. Well, Brother Roloff, Jack Hiles, they wasn't going to answer to anybody.
No.
And that's not the way things are supposed to be. And but anyways, I did want to kind of make this little timeline that I thought about the people. So when they first opened down there for the Rebekah home, it was in the trailers in the late 60s on that piece of ground. He had the City of Refuge and the other one that was for the boys. But when it started right there, so it was run by Raymond and Ernestine Weatherford, and they called them Granny and Papa. And I don't know. I think they were old when it started. And the only real references that I've read some things that some of the girls that were there way back said she was meaner than the devil. And I don't doubt that.
Yeah, neither do I.
And then on one of those, what was the name of the film?
Freedom's Last Call?
Freedom's Last Call.
Yes.
Brother Roloff says that when they first closed the home in 72, the state first come in and took all the kids away, that they were gripping a hold of Granny's neck and begging, please don't let them take me. Please don't let them take me. And I don't doubt that, because the Department of Children and Family Services has never removed a child in any kind of calm manner. You know, poor old Elian Gonzalez was there with his kin folks, and they ripped him away with, assault rifles in their arms. They're always super dramatic, DCF is, when they remove. Seems like they could be just a little bit more calm. I wouldn't want the job, but for pity's sake,
Yeah.
So I don't doubt that, but a lot of it's just panic, and I'm sure those children were panicked. But anyways, so Raymond and Ernestine Weatherford, Granny and Papa, they were the ones that lived in the trailers at first. Well, Brother Roloff, he said that the doctors told Raymond, said he was so broken, said he doesn't need to be around children for 2 years. Well, I don't believe that. I believe somebody from DCF said, you need to run them out of here. Probably told Brother Roloff, you need to send them on back to the house, because I'm sure they were mean.
Oh, yeah.
So after that, and you've probably heard some of the ladies, I hate to call them girls, some of the ladies talk about this, I'll tell you one that did, and I think what you're doing is great, because this is a scourge on Christianity, and it needs to be told. I'm a Christian, and one thing about Christianity, it's not, you don't withhold blame, and you sure don't ignore what's done to children, because Jesus said that you despise not one of these little ones, for in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father which is in heaven. And if I believe that God keeps a record, every time that somebody hurts a child, I've got to believe that my Lord and Savior has kept a record of that. And he also said, if you offend one of these little ones, and this is King James, it's better that a millstone be hung around your neck and for you to be cast into the sea than what's coming for you. God's not going to slight a child. And there's some horrible things that happen to children. But if we believe in God that sees all, I believe there's got to be a reckoning day coming. And I understand if I was in one of those homes, it'd probably turn me from the faith too, going through all people that profess the faith. But if I'm going to hold to my faith, things like this need to be told. And so I really believe that this is an instrument for truth, and I've enjoyed it. But the girl that was in Bethesda, she mentioned that, some of the other girls that had been there a little bit longer had talked about Uncle Bert and Aunt Dot Barnwell. When the Weatherfords left, or it probably was simultaneous, but in the early days of Rebekah, or whatever it was called at the time, out there on the farm, there was, his name was Hubert and Dorothy Barnwell. And they called them, I think they were a little bit younger than the Weatherfords, so they called them Uncle Bert and Aunt Dot. And they lived out there on the trailers. And from everything I've read and everything I've heard, she made Faye Cameron look like an angel.
Oh, that's tough to do.
She was mean. She was mean. And so at first, when they had the home there, they were kind of the head of it. And about the time that he built the Jubilee building, which I believe was in the middle to the late 60s, he also built Bethesda, which they're built on the same plan. They're the same look. So he sent them to Bethesda. And I cannot remember exactly where I read all this, but they were so mean to them girls at Bethesda that a lot of times that they would have them crawl across the floor naked and call them like you would a pig. Like, like you've heard people call pigs, sueys.
Yeah.
I'm not a farmer, but they would do that. And so Bert and Dot, they were originally from the Gadsden, Alabama area. Well, I believe that home was closed one time or something happened. And so in the night, they took when they went to Bethesda, they stayed there in about the middle 70s. I believe somebody got to snooping or something like that for Marsh Dees and them closed it down. The Wheels were in charge of it then. But before that, they took them girls and they left Hattiesburg and they went to Rome, Georgia.
Rome, Georgia.
In the middle of the night. And they started another place. Somebody had a house up there and gave it to them. And it was called Ruth's Home of Compassion. And they stayed, and it was not suburban, it was still a rural section, but I think there was some people that lived close by. That's where they lived. And them being from Gadsden originally, that was not far from Rome. So they were basically back home. I think one of their kinfolks probably gave them the house. Well, of course, they screwed down all the windows. The girls, you get the same story everywhere with Bethesda and with Bert and Dot. They kept the girls prisoner. Right. They thought of them as just absolute prisoners. Beat them, kept them locked up all the time. Well, one thing about the Roloff home, they worked on the farm. There was chicken houses. There was a farm. And, them girls like men out there. And I can't imagine how hot it would be working on a farm.
Well, I'm originally from Corpus Christi. Believe me, it gets hot in the summertime.
No doubt that place gets hot. But there's something to do. That was something to do. I know it was hell, but there was something to do. And what the worst part of prison is when you're in solitary confinement. There's nobody around and there's nothing to do. Well, there was nothing for these girls to do in that little house in Rome. So they would set them out with a pair of children's scissors and make all the girls get down on their knees on the outside in the backyard. And they had a high walled fence at Ruth's Home of Compassion. And they would take it and they would trim the grass with scissors. And they did that every day. That's just nuts.
Yeah, that is.
Well, there's so many independent Baptists in this area, and I kind of Gadsden, Rome, Chattanooga, kind of all of this, the rural section, and I live here. There's so many independent Baptists that they overlap. You'll see some people at certain places, if you're independent Baptist, or you might go to one meeting and see a lot of people and everything. Well, they would show up to different meetings and everything, and it was just odd. It was odd to these people here because they didn't know a great lot, about all this stuff. And so the people in that community outside of Rome where they had this house, they started to complain. And there was a write-up about it. And so this house lasted from whenever they got up there to probably the early to middle 80s. And it was run by Bert and Dot Barnwell. And so they finally, they had some helpers because they were getting aged out. And one of the helpers and his wife, they split because he took up with one of the girls. And it was just last year that I heard that he had come to some meeting, of amongst the ranks of the brethren, that he had showed up with, after all these years, he had showed up with this girl. Anyways, those girls, I guess that house was finally closed, either by the state of Georgia or the people in the community just didn't want it. And so that I know Bert died, and he's buried in Hattiesburg. and she might still be living. She'd be old, but she might still be living. They called her Aunt Dot Barnwell, but she'll be buried in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And they weren't from there, but I guess,
No.
the years working at home and all that, and he, from all accounts, he came from a good family, but he was mean. They were just mean. But they said that about, I have read, pages and pages, like you got to really dig, to see people's testimony. But I mean, they said that made Faye Cameron look like an angel. Said she was mean. She was absolutely mean. And of course, in the early days, there was all pregnant girls. So
Yeah.
there's no telling, what they would have done, and sent them out there. But there was nothing for them to do. But they took them in the middle of the night, which they were probably the first that did that, but they sure weren't the last. There's a lot of that night moving. They'll get them in a bus or something.
That's usually what they do. They'll do it in the middle of the night.
Yes.
When nobody's watching. Yeah. That's
And
the MO of those guys.
and so then so Bert and Dot left, and Raymond and Ernestine aged on, Granny and Papa, they aged on out, or went, the doctor told him, just he's too heartbroken to work with kids no more. Just broke his heart. He couldn't whoop up on no children no more, so he had to go back home. And so that's when, about that time, and I think it had been a little bit before then, Wiley and Faye Cameron, they were originally from Middle Georgia, around
Yes.
Macon. And I believe he originally worked at the City of Refuge, which was in Culloden, Georgia, which is in Middle Georgia, right there in that section, down below Atlanta. And so he worked down there. And about that time, this is before, Rebekah got built up. Brother Roloff moved the Camerons to Corpus, to the town, and he was the principal of the Park Avenue Christian Day School. That's where he started. Faye, and I've heard y'all make fun of her voice, and it's not really, but she had a little bit of musical training. Faye did. She could lead a choir, and all of those recordings that you have of the Honeybee Quartet and the girls singing or whatever, in the big choirs, that was under her direction. She had a little bit of musical training. Brother Roloff loved to hear singing, but he didn't know anything about music, but she did. So they moved down there. Well, right about that time, when he was principal there, she was probably teaching, I would say, or maybe she stayed at home. I don't know, but they were living in Corpus. About that time, Bert and Dot had, gone to Bethesda, and the Weatherfords aged out. Brother Roloff himself was getting older. So he was born in 1916, which would make him 60 in 76. So he was aging, and flying all over the place and all that. So, he was old, and so he moved them down there. And of course, y'all know the story from them, that just kind of in a real flash, he got to be, really in charge of things. Wiley Cameron did. And so I don't really know, and they have some children.
Yeah, Wiley Cameron Jr.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I guess they live, and maybe a daughter.
I'm not sure.
I know they live in Georgia, because I think if Faye's still living, that's who she lives with. Okay, then that's who she lives with. But anyways, they got in charge down there, and I've listened and read and all that, and this is, I guess, what's so odd to me. She was mean to them girls, Faye was. The woman could use a paddle. I believe that was one of her gifts. And it might have been fake, but I really believe there was something maternal about her, because not a one of them girls, everyone can name her first name and last name, and they can't do that for anybody else. There was some attachment that they all had to her, and I can't figure it out, but I'm not a psychologist.
Well, when I interviewed Donna, she, she talked about Wiley Cameron and his little ways of, looking at the girls with a wink and smelling his cologne and stuff. I'm sure you saw
Right.
that podcast.
Yeah.
And Donna said that, well, maybe Faye was, knew what Wiley Cameron was doing,
Yeah.
kind of flirting with him, and it made her angry. So instead of taking it out on Wiley Cameron, she took it out on the girls.
And
That's a possible.
those,
That's plausible.
yeah, I think that too. And I'll tell you another thing. Those churches are so hard on the women. They're hard on the women. In their place, and it's just ever reminded, if you don't allow pants in your church, don't allow pants in your church. There's plenty of Pentecostal bodies that are like that, but they don't, it's not the same. They're not so hateful about it, but they're so hateful about it in a lot of those churches about the women that the women hate one another.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And I think that, but I do believe that there was something about her, even if they loved to hate, there was an attachment. She had some attachment to them that who were the people that came after them? The Barretts or whatever the Barrett people.
I think so. The Barretts, yeah.
Those girls did not have the attachment to them. They didn't have the attachment to the Barnwells because they can't name them. They just can't name them other than, Ain't Daughter, a fleeting memory, she was hateful or something. But there was something about Faye. I don't know. Maybe deep down she did care, but she was ignorant and all she knew to do was just beat the hell out of them. Because violence begetteth violence. And another thing is, I believe everything that's told. I believe that they beat them girls too much and all that abuse. I've never doubted that. But to a lot of people, that's normal. Particularly in the South.
Well, the Bible says, "Spare the rod, spoil the child."
Yeah, it says the blueness of a wound driveth away evil.
But it doesn't say, "Spare the fist, spoil the child."
That's true. And another thing is, and I've never understood this. And, the girls will say this, a lot of them. Well, I think Donna was the same way. She was raised independent Baptist. You're in the church that teaches the Bible and says, raise your children in the admonition of the Lord. And when they're old, they won't depart from it. Or, see that you reverence your parents, honor thy father and thy mother, and thy days on earth shall be long. The father's the head of the home. The mother's the heart of the home. They teach all this, but then they would give their children away. I can't understand that. I mean, for a faith that puts so much emphasis on the home, to turn your children loose. But the sad part is, if I opened my house up and said, I'm going to start taking in stray children, my phone would ring off the hook just like Roloff's did.
Yeah.
Because people that just don't care.
They're desperate,
Yeah, they're desperate for whatever reason. It might be legitimate, it might not. But these parents that either just don't care or they will give their child away.
Well, if you put the title Christian in it, automatically, okay, Christian, it's got to be good.
Right.
You know what I mean, they love Jesus, all that stuff.
Right. But if they're Christian, if you are a Christian parent, seems like you would want to raise your own kid. I mean, that's kind of part of it.
Yeah, or go to the pastor with this child and have the pastor counsel you or something,
Right, or something. But I just, that's always kind of blown my mind about it all. But, the thing about all this was, well, then, the Camerons, so they stayed in Corpus for a long time, and then they packed up and they went to the Pensacola area.
Right. Well, they had to leave Texas.
Right, because she was barred from, Texas said, we're retiring the paddle, Miss Faye.
Yeah.
No more paddling. So she left and they moved and they bought that piece of land and a little house in Pace, which is just outside of Pensacola, just across the Escambia Bay. And they started that home. Well, they were members of a church there in town, and I did know their pastor, although they had, when I got there lived in there, they were real old, and I wasn't their pastor, and I wasn't pastor of that church I lived in. I pastored another church in town that was actually Southern Baptist. Um, so we would kind of run across those people, but not often. So by that time, that home I think was shut down by the state
Yeah, it
of
was.
Florida. New Beginnings was, and the land. I don't know if it was ever bought or if it was just given, but I've got a sneaking suspicion it was just given. There was another person that opened it up, and it's now called Marvelous Grace Girls Home.
Oh,
And when I lived down there, and it was run by a man named Brother Blankenship. Well, he still is running it. And when I lived down there, we would go to different revivals and things, and we would see them out there, and it was just more of the same, same testimony, same story, same all this. They'd get up and sing. They could sing pretty. They train the girls to sing pretty, raising money. Small, though it was a small place. And so it's still running. And somewhere I've got a CD of them singing, and there's a testimony on that, and that little girl says, my friend of mine and I listened to it, and we figured it up about how old she was at the time and about when she was talking about this. Just, she had that spirit of rebellion, and she was rebelling against her mother and dad, but the Lord led them to Marvelous Grace Girls Home and all this. Well, she was only in the second grade. What kind of rebelling are you doing in the second grade? I mean, I was mean as a striped snake in the second grade, but at the same time, I mean, I wasn't rebellious. I was just mean. And a lot of little kids are just mean. Who gives their child away at 9 years old? I don't understand that. There's something.
It always seemed like, because I've listened to a lot of Roloff sermons, a lot of them. I can't even count. But it seems like every testimony the girls gave, it was almost like they were reading off a script. Hi, my name is whatever, so and so. I was defeated. They always say I was defeated. I was defeated by sin and drugs and everything the world had to offer. That was like one of the lines that they always used.
Yep.
And of course, I came to the Rebekah home. Brother Roloff helped me. I got saved, and
I got saved, and now here I am, and I just thank God, and I'm gonna stay here for. And 1 year we saw them out, the Marvelous Grace Girls Home girls, and there was a girl, and she was probably 18 or something, and she gave this testimony, and she said, I was defeated.
I'm telling you, it's cookie cutter.
And but she said, this place has been such a blessing to me, and said, I'm gonna stay. That's what she said. I'm turning 18, but I'm gonna stay. I'm staying here. Well, about a year later, I guess, we saw the girls again. And my friend that had been in that church service, she leaned over and said, hey, that girl that was going to stay. I said, she got the crap out of there. She got out of there. She got up in church and said what she had to say. But, she got out of there. And I think a lot of church members are like me. It's not normal. It's weird. We have that attitude. If the girls would just say one thing to us, we'd do something. I remember just waiting and waiting for this little girl to say something. And finally, this other preacher said, go ahead and whatever it was, speak to her, because she'd stand there all night. And I thought to myself, my plan is that she'd stand there all night, But the truth is, most of these girls, their rights are signed away to these homes. These homes are their guardians, and there's nothing that we can do. There's nothing we can do. I can't believe that, other than call DCF, which is, if you see, and let me say this about Marvelous Grace. It's more of the same. It's cookie cutter, but I have never heard any abuse come out of this place. I can't say that I've ever heard that. It's a smaller group. We used to see them a lot more, but their bus broke down, and then we just didn't see them that much anymore. I don't know if they got another bus, but they would have them out. They had them out a lot. They would go sing in town. They would go, sing at Christmas parades. And so it was weird, just like the rest of them were, but it was not, nobody's ever said anything, as far as to my knowledge, that there was abuse. And there might have been, but I just haven't heard that. But it was still odd. It's not normal. It's not good. And I truly have, because I love church people, and I've got to believe that most of them are probably sitting there thinking the same thing. And I went back to a big independent Baptist church. I don't attend there, but I went for some Christmas service or something. This has been a couple of years ago. This was here in the Chattanooga area. And somebody stood up, and they had gone to one of them girls' homes and taken cleaning supplies. And he said, and there was probably 500 people there. And he said, we loaded up all that stuff that the church had collected. We had detergents and bleach and Windex and all that. When we got in there, there wasn't one paper towel. There wasn't one drop of detergent. There wasn't no soap. And when those little girls opened up those boxes full of bleach and all that clean, it was just like Christmas. And I just want to stand up and say, this ain't normal. This is not normal. Yeah. Am I the only one listening to this mess? This is not normal. Number one, nobody should be that excited about a bottle of bleach and a tube of Ajax. Number two, the fact that they were running a girls' home and didn't have a bar of soap.
Yeah,
there's something.
Where's the money that's being donated? Or
Absolutely, it's got to be coming from somewhere. Which I know a lot of these churches do give monthly to these places. But one of the problems is ain't nobody got nothing to show for it. There's just nothing. So that's where the Camerons, they wound up down there, and then eventually, I don't know if he died in Florida or he died in Georgia, but I know she wound up back in Georgia.
Well, you know how he died, right?
He burned, didn't he, or something?
Yes. And like I told Donna, it's kind of ironic, the story of how he died, because I do have some Wiley Cameron sermons. You can't really find them. They're not, I have like 10 of them. That's where I got Faye's singing voice. And he was preaching this one sermon called A Man on Fire. And it was about the rich man and Lazarus. You remember that story?
Yeah.
Rich man, the rich man wakes up, he's in hell after he dies, and Lazarus in Abraham's bosom, which is to simulate Jesus, is what Wiley Cameron said. And then, of course, he dies he was welding. And the welder arced on his wedding ring and caught his clothes on fire. I always knew Faye would be the death of him. I always knew that.
She got him.
She got the wedding ring.
I wonder if she even went to the funeral. I don't know. Maybe after all those years, she said, I got the wedding ring, got you, finally. But as far as I know, she lived. So they, I know that church in Florida, would update every once in a while. You'd hear something about, brother and sister Cameron, but I know that they went on to where they did. But there was another home that was out there where I lived in Florida. So that home was real close by, maybe 20 miles from where I lived. But there was another home, and that home was called the Lighthouse, and it was in Jay, Florida.
I've heard of that.
Yeah. It was started by a Palmer man, Palmer.
Michael Palmer.
I don't know him. He was not there when I was there, but I know that's who started it. Well, Jay was a farming community. It's Jay, Florida, and it's right on the Alabama line. And back in the 1970s, they struck oil in Jay. And everybody that had oil on their land, they became millionaires overnight. And they built these humongous mansions. I mean, these people went from just two-bit farmers, sharecroppers, and all that to just millionaires. So they built these huge houses. The problem was if they struck oil in 71, it dried up in 73. So they had all these mortgages they couldn't pay for. So there's all these great big houses out there. Still to this day, these great big old houses. Well, Palmer, um, let me think how this went. He moved to Jay and bought that house because he had been run out of California
Shocker.
for the same thing. And so he moved out there. Well, not only is Florida kind of lax about stuff like that, but it also it's way off the beaten path. And the house sat far back off the road. But I mean, it's a mansion. It was a mansion. So he had that home for a long time. And then from maybe like 90 to 2005, he was there. Well, some girl come in and said she had raped him back in the 90s, but there wasn't, it was past the statute of limitations. Nevertheless, he left and went to Mexico.
Oh, you mean he raped her? You said she raped him?
No, I'm sorry.
That's right.
He raped her.
He raped her.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
He raped her is what she said, and then, but there wasn't, there wasn't the proof, and it was past the statute of limitations. Nevertheless, he left, and he left it to a man named Cookston, Cookston.
Yep.
Well, he had that, and the people in Jay just, they all knew each other, and everybody knows each other down there still. Everybody goes to church, and it was just weird. They'd see the girls out, and they were in these. It was much, much more puritanical looking than Roloff's uniforms ever. There was a little bit of individuality to Roloff stuff, even in the blue and red dresses and all that. This was like just gray, just very puritanical looking. I mean, much so. Well, they lived in that big old house that sat back off from the road, but you see them every once in a while. They didn't go to church anywhere as far as I know. They had church in there, and it stayed open for a long time. Well, under Cookston, somebody told something that the girls were being locked up, and there was a big story written about it, and DCF got involved, and he loaded them girls up on a bus, and he was headed for, as far as what I know, the Mexican border. Because Palmer lived down there. And, of course, they finally got him and everything. Well, that house sat empty for a long time. And I'm nosy. I'm real nosy. And so I saw that it was up for auction. Well, there was a holiness church, a Pentecostal church that just wanted in the community up there, and they just wanted a bigger space for their school. They had a legitimate Christian school, and they needed space to grow, so they bought it. And sweet people, very sweet people. He's a dentist. They still have the Christian school there. He's a dentist. Big family. Everybody. Just pillars of the community. But they're holy, which is like a Pentecostal.
Pentecostal, not Baptist. Yeah.
No, and matter of fact, I called a friend that was as nosy as I was, and I said, "Hey, let's go to Jay." So we went on to Jay. Well, that big old house sold for, next to nothing. This 1970s mansion, 3 stories, sold for next to nothing. Full swimming pool in the back and all that. And so we went up there, and those holiness people said, we said, well, we're so glad y'all got it, which I was, but I was being nosy, but I was glad they got it. And I even remember thinking then, the hurt that was done in the name of Christ in this building. I'm glad that real Christian people are here, and maybe they'll bring some healing. And so I told them, and they said, well, take a look. Just go and look at everything. And I said, I sure will. And so I took me a tour. So we go in this place. It's overly feminine. Everything's pastel. There's still border, wallpaper. Big flowers on everything. You can see their chapel, pink and pale green, mint green, and all that stuff. This is on the first floor. So we go from that. Um, there's a medical examining room, like anybody had a high school diploma that was
Right.
worth anything, much less an MD. We go in there and they had cut out the letters in cursive. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine. They had that up on the wall, you know, where I'm sure they would administer medicine and examine the rooms or
Yeah.
there was examining room and all that. And then there was next to it was the lockdown room.
Oh.
So, and you could see that, and all those places have one of those
Oh
things.
yeah.
They have a lockdown room. And so, we just went from one place to another. Well, the house, the actual mansion and the rooms that were originally built were not used. They were still intact the way they were when the first family that built it many years before. There was, just big chandeliers covered in dust. There was, just ornate bedrooms and everything. None of that was ever used in
Hmm.
this mansion. They had put, if the mansion was 3 stories, they had put a 3-story addition onto it. So you kind of had to meander through the house that was big anyways to get back to it. And when we got back to it, now all that lush and plush and a true mansion, and I mean a true mansion, it was outdated, but it was a true mansion that they could have put those girls in. They built this addition and it was just row after row after row of bunk beds. And at the back of that, I mean, there was just gray dresses from here to yon. And they were big jumper type, they had the big stripes that came down here to wear with a white blouse and just so ugly. And I, it was bizarre. And we just looked, my friend and I looked at each other and, we just couldn't believe it, but we had to keep going, because we come for the show. And so we went, just from room to room, and we got back there where they had the school room, and that ACE education that you got was like a Harvard diploma for what these girls were getting. They had by
Hmm.
that time pulled off of that and just made up their own, And but the thing was, like in this place, there was nothing for them to do. In Ruth's Home of Compassion, there was nothing for them to do. In Bethesda, there was nothing for them to do. And all these underground homes, that's why they write 5 million sentences. There's no farm. They don't have sewing machines. They don't teach the girls typing. If you want to raise a girl and all she knows is how to sew and all that, she'd be a little bit under skilled for today, but at least she know how to sew. But these places aren't even teaching them that.
No.
These modern day places. I honestly think they locked them up inside of houses, and that's it. But it was so bizarre that the actual house they weren't allowed to live in. It was like it was too nice. They had put an addition on this place so that the girls had to sleep in barracks. There was no reason for them girls to be sleeping in barracks. I went to college for a short while with a girl that was in that home. And she said, yeah, I mean, it was really strict, but it was okay. But once again, she had come from a really broken home. But you got to take their word. You have to take their word. The ones that were there, the ones that say it was a good experience, the ones that say it was bad. They were there. We
Right.
weren't. Um,
The,
but
the way you're describing the house, I can picture the front where you got the girl in the really poofy dress with Colonel Sanders in his white suit, with the little jar of iced tea.
yeah, I mean, it just was so overly overdone, over feminine and all that. Well, they got it and they put their Christian school in there and it's still running to this day. And, it's just everyday people, there now. And I thank the Lord for that because there was so much hurt and you could just tell, I'm not big on feelings and vibrations or anything like that, but there was just a lot of hurt in there, of, of making a girl feel worthless. And like so many of those girls say, I wasn't bad. I was just from a bad home. I was just from a bad home. And I don't, I just, it bothers me that anybody could look the other way or not even look the other way, but see the proof and not condemn it because nobody sitting in a church that it was a parent and worth of salt in their bread would want their own child in a place like that, you know?
Yeah, I think as far as the church members were concerned, if a girl came up and said, they're abusing me, I'm sure they probably already had forewarning from the pastor, whether it was Roloff or Cameron, that these girls are troubled. They're going to tell you anything to get out of
Yes,
this. You know what I mean? So they already had that forewarning. So if a girl came up and said, they're abusing me or whatever, yeah, okay, sure, and just
right.
I think that's what happened.
Well, I think it happened too, but I think people should be able to have more sense, and you don't have to be, super empathetic to tell just something's wrong.
Kind of
Something's wrong.
investigate a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's just from a church member standpoint, but it finally bothered me bad enough that I just kind of had to. I didn't leave the church. I didn't leave my faith. I still attend church regularly and everything. But as far as that hardcore, independent, fundamental Baptist, I just couldn't. If they weren't going to do something about it, if they weren't going to call it out, I just couldn't have no part. Because separating yourself from wrongdoing is a Baptist virtue. If you're doing something wrong, I can't have no part of that.
Right.
I'm not going to have no part of it. I'm going to separate. And if they couldn't separate, then I couldn't have no part of that. And so, just from a church member standpoint, I just couldn't look at it no more. But 10 years ago, as a young whippersnapper, I definitely thought if these girls would just tell me one thing. But now I realize there would have been nothing I could do, save call DCF, which maybe I should have, but really there's so little because their parents put them there. There's so little that can be done,
Yeah.
and as bad as Rebekah was, the minute that Rebekah proper was closed, all these places went underground. At least people could go to Rebekah, and there was the Christian Alamo, and there was the fights, and people knew where it was. You don't know where these places are.
Well, the thing also with Lester Roloff's homes is he didn't charge a dime for these homes. Not like they're doing now, where
Right.
parents are paying $3,000-$4,000. But he relied on, of course, offerings,
Right.
donations. Yeah, he had big donors, and when that all dried up, I mean, there are still two homes there,
Hmm.
but they've gotten out of the child business, so to speak.
Right.
These homes it's the Roloff men's home and the Jubilee home, which are for
Hmm.
adult people. So
Yeah.
they're not dealing with children. I think they learned their lesson.
Well, you know, you're taking in troubled kids, but as has been said so many times, in old newspaper clippings and stories, and even what y'all have said, the only qualification that the people that were working with the children had was that they just wanted to be there
Yeah.
for whatever reason. And of course, and I've had dyed in the wool independent Baptist church members that are still in the thick of it today say to me, what grown man wants to spend his life in a home full of little girls? And I'm not alleging any abuse, but there is something weird about that. And it's not always sexual abuse, it's not always physical abuse, but there's just something odd about it, that, and maybe it takes an odd person to run, orphanages, and abuse happens rampant in foster care system and all that. There's no doubt about that. It's just we expect more from people to say that they're Christian.
Christian homes
And
should be a cut above the rest. They should be an
absolutely,
example.
they should be an example. And so after they just nobody in the movement would condemn, and of course the independent Baptist churches diminished, so much. Used to in the 1970s when it was at its height, every largest church in a state would be an independent Baptist church.
Oh yeah.
But now it's not like that
It's
at
a
all.
shell of its former self now.
Absolutely, it is. And I believe that the child abuse, and particularly the sexual abuse, the physical and sexual abuse, that happened, it had a lot to do with it because I don't believe, if my God is just and he says, and he's made a promise, and the angels of these children do always behold the face of my Father and can speak to him, then I believe God will fulfill his promise, for through whatever it is. And another thing, we talk about bearing fruit. But I believe it's in John. It says that you might go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit remain. That your fruit remains, and none of Roloff fruit remains.
No.
None of it remained. You know, it says, that a corrupt tree or an incorrupt tree is not going to bring forth corrupt fruit. It was all corrupted for whatever reason, whether he was direct into it or not. It has not remained. And
I think Lester Roloff was just too trusting. I mean, you bring a guy in who was either, an ex-heroin addict, or he was, doing something sinful, ex-homosexual or whatever. Okay, brother, I found Jesus. Oh, well, sure, come on in. We got a job for you. You could take care of the boys
right,
at the boys' home.
right. And
Or
I hope that the boys, I hope eventually that the boys will speak up. Some of them,
yes,
because if they were that mean to the girls, I can't imagine how mean they were to the boys. I mean, really, because
I
boys can take a lot of rough, but few few stories about them. But the stories that have come out are even more horrendous, unfortunately. Like the boy that died. Where did he die at? They murdered him. Missouri.
oh,
Is that
I think it was Missouri. I think.
yeah? Uh, I hope that they speak up. But yeah, the fruit of this tree was corrupt, and it didn't remain. It was rotten, and it didn't remain. And so if we believe Jesus and we believe the Bible, then we've got to believe that he'll protect children, or that there will be a reckoning day for children that should have been protected. And so I'm so glad that you've got this podcast, and that people are listening. It might just be one or two, but the truth needs to be told, and the truth is going to stand when the world's on fire.
Yeah.
And I realize people liked Lester Roloff. He was, and the ones in the church, they liked him. He was their pastor. But you can tell a tree by the fruit that it bears, and the same with, so with all those that worked down there, there's just so few that any of them could say anything good about, because they weren't bearing any kind of fruit. And here, these children were in need, and they were slighted and punished for being in need,
Right.
And so I just, I did want to fill those in. If I couldn't do anything else, I kind of wanted to fill those little gaps in, because I can tell there's just little gaps. And of course, there's plenty more,
Yeah.
of people. But yeah, it was Burton Dot Barnwell, Raymond and Ernestine Weatherford, who they called Papa and Granny, and then, Wiley Faye Cameron. Blankenship took over the home after they left in Florida, and then the Palmers and the Cookstons had that house in Jay, Florida. But I just want right to be done. Whatever it takes. And all these people, just about are dead. There's not going to ever be any financial restitution or anything. And I'll tell you another thing about Ruth's Home of Compassion that I was told by somebody that knew what she was talking about. She said that the girls were required, that this is different from the rest of the homes. It's the same result, but the girls were required to take vitamins. But that when they got out of there, several of those girls were never able to have children. And I actually did know one girl that was. So they out and out gave them vitamins. How the rest of these girls were drugged not to have a monthly, I don't know. I don't know how you get that much birth control in food, but somehow they did it.
Well,
It
you've heard the podcast I did with Cindy about the Bethesda home.
I believe so.
Yeah, which she talked about. I mean, just some disgusting stuff. how they would
Yeah.
have the girls hold up their fingers so they could see if they've been playing with them. I mean, just ridiculous stuff. I mean, there's no need for that. You know,
No, there was no need. And the scary thing about Bethesda is that as bad as it was under the Willses and all that abuse and everything, that kind of the resounding uh, or the what's told is that under the Barnwells it was even worse.
yeah,
It was worse. And of course, I know the one girl said that they'd make them douche with Lysol and all that stuff. And I believe they intentionally sterilized them that way. And I'll tell you why is because Lysol was originally developed for that, for ladies to clean themselves. But it was made, and this would have been when the Barnwells were young people. But they had a problem back then in the 30s and 40s teaching women how to dilute. And so women were sterilizing themselves by accident. And I believe that was intentional at Bethesda. And all that abuse was absolutely intentional. I believe it was intentional across the board. We mean to do what we mean to do. But yeah, it was, I don't know where they went or when exactly all that Ruth's home of compassion, but when they left Rome, I guess they just aged on out, and he's buried in Hattiesburg, and I guess she will be too if she's.
you know
But,
when I did the podcast with Donna, she what was really nice about her podcast is she was behind the scenes, because I always
yes,
wondered what were the staff members doing. I mean, they acted holier than thou while they were there, but what was it like in the place they called Trailer Row, where all the trailers were? Because they didn't have the only one that had a house was Lester Roloff. He had this big
right,
2-story house. Everyone else
yeah,
were in trailers. And she said, the people that were heroin addicts that found Jesus were still heroin addicts. They were doing heroin.
uh,
They had TVs, which Roloff was against.
yes,
They were drinking. She said the Wiley Cameron Jr., while he was at, I think it was Bethesda, they stopped there. He had a bottle of whiskey down in it.
Well, there was no, honestly, and you went to school there. Um, the rules were oppressive and would stifle. Because I went to a school that was real strict, told us what to wear and all that stuff like that.
Right.
Um, Matter of fact, they didn't allow headphones, and to this day, I still don't have headphones. When you said, "Do you have headphones?" I said, I in vain looked around because I didn't have none. Um, and I mean, I don't think I'm gonna go to hell if I have headphones, but they didn't allow them, and so I just kind of was raised up not having no headphones. So, um, but anyways, beyond your wife not wearing a pair of breeches, what other oversight was there if you lived on Trailer Row?
Right.
What? I mean, nobody held anybody accountable. The church members didn't hold one another accountable. There wasn't church discipline. There wasn't, and I mean formal church discipline, like, this person has, done this or whatever, like they did in days past, many, many years ago. But, even the preacher, Roloff wasn't holding anybody accountable. He was flying around on a plane.
He was too busy doing other things. Yeah.
He was too busy. And so, nobody ever, basically, if you dress the part, which unfortunately is a problem in fundamentalism because they've minored on the way you dress, or majored on the way you dressed, and minored on a lot of stuff that's a lot more important. If you dress the part, you can get away with murder because you dress the part, because you have that outward sign. So, yeah, that don't shock me. But I thought that was very good that Donna was, behind the scenes. But I tell you, the one that broke my heart was the girl that was in Bethesda, whose mother and dad, she was there when they got rescued. I can't remember her name. But
Probably Lita, probably.
that was it. I could just tell she was just a beautiful lady. I'll never see her or anything like that, but you could just tell. I mean, her heart just ached. And I can totally understand why, if all you ever saw or knew from church people was ones that threw you into a place like that, and they said that they were church people, I probably never have nothing to do with church folks either. Now, church people I've been around, they've been the real deal. But if you've never been around the real deal, I get that. I understand that,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
and I, the Lord doesn't abandon those, you know. Um, I just, I mean, it's just horrendous what she went through. But thanks be to God that that girl spelled deer wrong,
Yes.
because who knows how long that would have gone on even past that. Um, but yeah, so I don't know if this is beneficial to the podcast or not, but I just wanted to give kind of the fill-ins of the little things that I kind of collected over the
Oh
years.
man, this has been very interesting. I mean, some of the stuff you've talked about, I had no idea.
Yeah.
No idea.
Well, I hope that the podcast keeps going and the truth keeps coming out. Well, it will,
Yes.
whether it's me and you talk telling the truth, or the truth will prevail.
I've always looked at it as, if you've watched movies, you see, like if it's a spy movie, you'll see that big white chalkboard on the wall, and you get all those little red lines pointing to everything. At the very center, you got that was Roloff. Roloff was the very center, the epicenter of all this, and it just branched off into all these other places because they followed his teachings, you
They
know,
did,
and
they did, and
he believed the Bible literally.
he did, and he believed strong in corporal punishment, and he was raised that way, no
Yes.
doubt. Raised his own children that way, and I'm sure it was hard. My parents believed in corporal punishment, but not to the extent that their parents did. But my grandma to me was just an angel. But they said, in her day, she was raised on a farm, and I mean, you didn't mess up, and they didn't have time to teach you anything. You just got your tail wore out and everything.
Right.
But the problem with all this is Roloff didn't have a church. Rebekah was not a church. A church is made of willing congregants, and
Right.
children, and then the children make their choice whether they want to stay in the church or not when they come of
Yes.
age. But it wasn't a church. Those people weren't allowed to leave. And so, what would it have taken? What could those girls have done or submitted to that would have made them happy? They were always just going to treat them like, and he would say, like they're not troublemakers or they're not jailbirds anymore or whatever, but yet they were treated that way. Even, I don't, have you ever seen the film that was made after uh, Freedom's Last Call, They Stood?
Yes.
Yeah. The day that they closed that in 79, and I believe it was Barbara that said she left in 79 and she thought it closed. Well, it did close in 79. They went and got all them kids again. But there's a few girls left, and they say, we just want to stay. And they're there with Faye and Brother Roloff and all that, and they're just 4 or 5 girls, and they just, that one girl, she just wants to stay. She just wants to stay. But there she was, probably the top worker, dressed just exactly. There she was, loving on Brother Roloff and all that. They didn't treat her no better than they treated the rest of them. All them girls got treated like trash. There wasn't nothing they could do. There was some that they would treat better to an end, to get some other girl in trouble. But nobody at them places was treated good. There was nothing they could do.
Now there was a guy, and I think it's when you text me, you were talking about this Marine with the
Cleve
patch on his back.
McLaren. Cleve McLaren.
Cleve McLaren.
Yes. He and his wife was Miss South Carolina.
Ah, okay.
And I don't really know what the connection was to Roloff other than maybe just a church thing and him being a hero or whatever. He might still be living. I know the wife is. But she went along. Well, I mean, she didn't go along with it. I'm sure she did believe it at the time, and it was the thing to do, and it was the 1970s, and they were standing against the culture. And the 1970s were such a time of great change, that of just sweeping change, if you'll look at it, roles in the home, Roe v. Wade, the way people dressed. I mean, it was all changing in a hurry, in to an extreme sense, that it almost made sense in a way that that the counterculture was just so crazy and back the other way, which it was, roll off and on. But the last time I seen them, and I looked them up on social media somewhere, and I'm not condemning the woman for this, but there she is, telling them she was so, kind to them girls, and just that they were learning just how to be ladies and their standards of dress and blah 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 blah, and everything. And the last picture I seen her, she had on a pair of pants, and I just thought, where did all this go?
Well, if you look on the People's Baptist Church Facebook page, there's a picture there. I believe it's either the profile picture or it's the page picture. There's like maybe 30 people all taking this picture. Some have pants, some have long hair. I mean, it is completely changed.
It's completely changed. And all that really was an answer to what was going on. Just like the banishment from Eden was an answer to eating the fruit. Just like eating the fruit was an answer to being told you couldn't. And so all that Roloff and all that was an answer to the sweeping changes. This is one place that's not going to change, and we're going to raise up a people that don't change. But it didn't happen. He didn't bear fruit. The Amish have not changed.
Well, they do have the Amish light, or the Mennonites.
Right, but I mean, their fruit has remained. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Their fruit remained. It wasn't corrupt. They have not changed. I don't want to be Amish, but they have not changed. But, nobody's still doing the same things anymore. Nobody adhered to his diet after he left. You can't tell me that Wiley and Faye got that big when he was living. They didn't. And if you'll look on that thing from the early, which I know, they were getting older and you get a little bit bigger the older you get. But now Faye was a trim. She wasn't pretty, but she was a trim thing in 1979. You look at a picture from about 83, a good year that Brother Roloff was gone. She was a big girl. See, they wasn't following that.
Oh yeah.
He
was big on health.
Yes. Yes, he was big on health. And I think that's another thing about the donors and the farm and all that stuff. It wasn't no way I'd want it, because they would make the girls eat the whole apple, core and everything, the whole rind of the grapefruit. Just crazy stuff.
Yeah.
I don't think it was abusive. I just think he was a health nut.
You can't be eating the seeds. That's got cyanide in it. Yeah.
I think they did make him eat it all. Maybe they got him, but I know they had to eat the core and all, because that's been told a couple of times. But, he was a big health nut or whatever. But see, nobody adhered to that. He left and nobody adhered to it. But it's crazy, and it's hard to put everything together, because all that happened at Rebekah, it was brand new. There never was a time that thing was not under controversy. There never was a time that DCF wasn't trying to close it. It was all brand new. From the time they started it to the time, it didn't last. It was always bad from the start. It was corrupt from the start.
Yeah.
And because the government didn't have anything, and honestly, Brother Roloff being gone so much, it probably really did shock him that the state came against him so hard, for no other reason than that the state had sent him quite a few.
Oh yeah, judges. Yeah,
the state would send people down there, and so no doubt he was a little confused. He didn't know what was going on. Maybe it wasn't so bad when they sent him, but I really don't believe that. I believe they were rough on them kids from the start.
I know there's a video on YouTube where there's a judge talking. It's like towards the end of the video. I can't remember the name, but
I can't either.
But you know which video I'm talking about. Where there's a judge talking, has these two guys next to him talking about how they were armed robbery and everything, but he sent him to Roloff instead, and they became.
And a judge is a judge. I don't think he was fake, you know.
No.
That was a real judge, you know, so no doubt he was a little confused. But the state didn't have it in for Roloff. It's just it didn't bear fruit. And so when there was nothing but abused children, I mean, from the day Rebekah opened that big dormitory, it was within a day of being closed. All that went down in just a short while. So it's no wonder that nobody can really remember a lot because everything is just, it just happens so fast. If you'll look, because when you're going through it, I'm sure every day was hell, you know.
Yeah.
And all that they put those girls through and all that, and the boys too, you know. Um,
I talked to
but
somebody. I talked to somebody. I can't remember his name. Older gentleman. Probably about 6 months ago, and he was talking about the lighthouse. He was there, and he didn't want to come on. I wish he had, but according to him, there was a lot of beatings going on, and there was widespread homosexuality going on.
well, see, weren't they down there on the water?
Well, they were, but the lighthouse was also on the farm because I remember when
Okay,
I was there in 80 from 81 to 82, the lighthouse and the anchor home were there on the farm.
yeah. Well, if they, particularly when they were down there,
The
I mean,
intercoastal canal, yeah.
yeah, who's going to touch them? You know, I
Yeah.
mean, nobody. You couldn't get down there to them. You know, and so I'm sure it did confound Roloff a little bit. You know that the same state that had sent him to it, but you know he didn't know what was going on, and that's no excuse. That's no excuse. He should have known what was going on. He
Yeah.
was the lead. He was the leader. Um, but you know, it has just bred, and I don't know what's worse now that there are so many of these homes. I mean, just in that little, and it was a rural county in Florida that I lived in, within 20 miles from my house that was not close to anything, was two of these homes.
There's thousands of them all over the United
Absolutely.
States.
Absolutely. And so I don't know what's worse that because when they went underground and they got these, I mean, they got these kids on buses and in the middle of the night. Now we just hear it time and time and time again. I mean, you can't reach them. And anymore, they don't come out for church. They used to come out for church. They don't hardly come out for church. And they rely on little, what they charge, and I know they charge and they don't use it for the kids. But you think about what it takes to keep up a person for a month, and a
Yeah.
little bit charge can't keep up that one kid. And then half of them don't pay, and I believe that. You know that half of them don't pay, and they make the other one's parents pay. You know, and they don't really know what's going on. Nobody's getting anything. There's
Mm.
no food. There's nothing for them to do. There's no schooling. No nothing. They're not allowed to go outside. There's no farm.
No TV.
There's no work. There's no TV. No internet. And I mean, there's just nothing. They're
But
just locked up.
but
Who knows?
there were some places that had Lester Roloff sermons playing 24 hours a day.
Oh yeah.
Wow,
Oh
talk
yeah.
about nails on the chalkboard.
Well, and see, that was I've listened to. There was, I think, 35 hours of tapes of Jim Jones that the FBI seized. When they went into Jonestown, there was a note that said, "Save the tapes, save the tapes," that there be a record. Um, and so I've listened to as much of those as I can find, and he would just talk. He was on psychedelic drugs and everything, but they would be working at Jonestown all day, but there was loudspeakers everywhere, and he'd just be talking, just preaching, ranting and raving.
While they're
Uh,
working. Yeah.
oh yeah, it was just his voice all the time. And then just as soon as they got to lay their weary bodies down from working in the guy in the sun, he would call them out and make them come to church that night. They were just so fatigued, you know, and it was for mind control and all that. And that's exactly what they were trying to do with them girls. It was for mind control. We say brainwashing, but I honestly think it takes an intelligent person to brainwash people. And I don't mean this to be ugly, but none of those people that worked down there were smart. None of them. They were typical, just backwards, ignorant,
Hillbillies.
mean. Yeah, yeah. And I'm a hillbilly. I'm from the country, but you know, those that know better do better.
That's right.
And we give them a little bit too much credit when we say, well, they were trying to brainwash someone. Them ignorant fools, they couldn't brainwash nobody.
Yeah.
But they did know how to break a wheel. That's what they were trying to break. A wheel, just like you break a horse, which it can be done a lot of different ways. But back in the day, I mean, it was rough, and that's what they were trying to do to them kids. And a lot of them, they did. They just break that wheel. And to an extent, a child, your own child, you do have to break the will of that child from doing, whatever he wants to do if it's causing harm. But these were not their children.
And some of these kids came in broken already.
Absolutely.
So it was easy.
And I think a lot of times it's easy because we're so sympathetic and we believe the girls, and I do, and it doesn't lessen my sympathy for them at all. But you have a child that was brought in, and she's from an abusive home, and she gets there, and it's so strict, and there's no understanding, and she don't like it, and she wants out, and all she's ever done is seen mom and daddy fight. She gonna throw a fight too, and if Big Faye's around the corner, she gonna throw down too, because she's the same way. She's the same way.
Yeah.
Violence begetteth violence, and there's a time for spanking and all that, but what they did was spanking, just like that judge. He said, I'm not worried about the bottoms that are pink. I'm worried about the ones that's black and blue and bloody.
Oh, yes. Better a pink bottom than a black soul.
That's right.
Lester Roloff said.
Yeah, that's right. And so, they beat the fool out of them girls back then. And it just, that violence has just begetteth violence. And it's just not right. It's not what you're supposed to do. And those are not, no matter what you're trying to do with a child, that was not their children. That's not their children. Yeah. I don't know why their parents would have gave them away in the first place. But that wasn't theirs. But they didn't have it in them to do anything but what they did, because they were just backwards, mean. A lot of them were old. They started out just ignorant. And so they got all these girls, and like you said, it got too big. And so the plan was, if a child breaks a rule, you beat the child. And now they got 600 kids, and they stay beating kids all the time.
And there was no background checks, I'm sure. Like I said, if you were saved, if you were born again, that's your qualification.
Well, and there wasn't any background checks. There wasn't any background checks back then. There's a little bit of understanding, even though it was so horrible. There's a little bit of understanding in that Roloff was born in 1916. He didn't know nothing about none of that. He just did what he had always seen done. The rest of these people, whether they got some sexual thrill off of whipping kids or whatever, that's all they'd ever done was just whip on kids, beat on kids. And the kids were probably used to it, unfortunately. Unfortunately, they were. Not all of them, but I'm sure a vast majority of them, because, that was kind of how you raised children for a long time, was a lot of that. But nowadays, there's not no background check, but we don't know who's, I can't name any of these people. And I know there's some around here, because like when I heard that report from taking that to that girl's home down there, I don't know who's running that place.
Yeah.
I know down, the Chattanooga Free Press run a story on, maybe Halloween or something. There was a fundamentalist school for the deaf down there, and they was whooping the fool out of them kids. Well, I'd passed down that road 100 times. I didn't know they had no school for the deaf down there, and I can't tell you who's running it. Everything's underground, and that's what's scary. I really don't know if there's any hope.
Keeping a low profile. Yeah.
Oh, they do keep a low profile. Yeah, most definitely. Unless, you stay in those churches to try to infiltrate. But then again, I just don't know what else you can do. I don't know what you could do.
Hopefully, somebody comes out and tells their story.
Yeah. But can there be anything preventative? I don't know, because you have a mother and dad that's willing to not do their homework and send their kids off to somebody they don't know because that person says they're saved. And then they close the door and all that ends. And now, if you'll read a lot of reports or talk to people that were in, like the school at Jay, the Lighthouse, or New Beginnings, or the different ones, or that one at what was that one at Mobile, over around Mobile? Was it Victory or something? It was awful.
Oh, Victor Christian Academy.
Was that at Mobile?
I think that was there was one in California and there was one in Jay, Florida.
This was somewhere over around there. It was a man that ran it, and it was mostly boys.
I'm not sure. There's so many of them, Austin. There's so many of them. I can't keep up with it.
One matter of fact, yeah, I can't tell you who it is. But there's no excuse today for not running a background, for yourself. Right. Seeing, but they don't. I mean, they're willing to give their kids away, and I don't know as it'll ever. Matter of fact, I've got a close friend from school, my school years, the high school years, and his aunt and uncle had a boys' home in their house. They were Independent Baptist, and they lived in just a little industrial town, and he said what they did to those boys, it wasn't as much physical, even though my uncle would whip on them a lot and too much, but it was a lot of psychological. And we're just country people, we don't really know much about that stuff, but we knew it was weird enough to know. But it was just a little old house in a neighborhood, and they had 5 boys living there. And if that house had 2 bedrooms, it was a lot. It might have had 3, but it was tiny. You see, and I just don't know, other than the church, if you stayed in the church, because most Independent Baptist people do kind of know each other, because there's just a couple schools, there's Bob Jones, was Tennessee Temple, Pensacola Christian, there's ACE, Rebekah, all that. See, everybody's kind of connected. And I know when ABC ran that story on Independent Baptist abuse in the churches or whatever, all them preachers said, well, we're independent. We don't know each other. I thought, well, that's the biggest bunch of lies I've ever heard in my darn life. I know. I might not know them personally, but when I was independent, still this day, I could go probably to every state and name somebody I knew that was Independent Baptist.
Yeah.
And they're not all evil and they're not all mean, but we all know each other. It's a small group of people, Isn't
there like a place where all the Independent Fundamental Baptists not get together, but all the bigwigs, some sort of council or something?
No.
Mm-mm.
No, they did get along. They would get along for a while, and then they wouldn't get along no more. And they'll still link up, and some will talk to others and everything. But when some of the big names died back in the 90s and early 2000s, Jack Halls, Lee Robertson, it just kind of, they're not really connected anymore, but they're still small enough through the colleges and through everything. But, I just don't know. But like what I was saying earlier, when I went to that church and they were giving the report on all that stuff, that they'd give in the bleach and all that, that had to be close by. But here I live not 25 miles, from that church, and I have no idea where they were talking about. I don't know, And so I just don't know. I don't know if the closure of Rebekah made it worse.
It may have caused it to spread, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad it did, because it was just hell for them girls, but I don't know as it made it worse.
It seems
and
like... Go ahead.
I don't know if there's any way, we can do anything about it, but, much like the foster care system, we don't know,
Yeah.
Just don't know.
It's tears your heart apart, you know.
It tears your heart apart, and you just have to trust that one day, it's appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. That the Lord who sees all, the eyes of the Lord runneth to and fro in the earth, beholding the evil and the good. That one day there'll be a judgment, and I pray and hope that I believe that one day there'll be, because I don't believe that all this happened to these girls, and because there won't be a judgment on earth for them. Ain't no judge ever gonna pass no legislation for these girls, like all them girls that was in Bethesda. It might have got closed, but they'll never get financial restitution. Many of them will never get a peaceful night's sleep on this side. They'll never get closure with those people. See, because they're all dead.
Yeah.
All them people's dead.
How convenient.
How convenient. So there's nothing, there never will be a true reckoning on this side, ever.
Right.
And so I just have to say, all these girls that got abused, that the Lord has seen, and that He is close to them that are brokenhearted. And He says that He comes to heal the brokenhearted. And I trust that maybe this podcast that you're doing is helping to heal some of those broken hearts, because there's a lot of people that don't know. But I just wanted, before I got to get off here, but I just wanted to kind of fill in some of the cracks, and I thank you for having me on.
Yep. Do you have any last remarks for the parents out there who are thinking of sending their kids to these places?
Yeah. You're the parent. It's your job to raise that child, and you raise that child. So if they're underage, that's on you. Don't you farm them out there to somebody else to raise. You're the parent. And if you believe what you say you believe, it's your job. And you need to finish the job. Because he who began a good work is faithful to complete it in you. That's your child. You need to complete it in them. You started it. You need to finish it.
There you go.
That's your job. If you believe the way you say you do, then that's your job. And that's all I'd say to them.
All right. Austin, thank you for being on. I appreciate it.
All right. You take care.
All right. Well, you got my number? If you want to get a hold of me?
All right. And you
We'll
just
talk
holler at
again.
me anytime.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
We'll see ya.